Budget 2018 is also a plan that respects the choice that Canadians made just a little over 2 years ago.
And the choice Canadians will make next year. So Bill Morneau is building a fiscal firewall on his left flank.
We know that diversity in the workforce boosts productivity and profitability.
The heavy focus on boosting opportunity for women is a pitch to the women voters who already heavily support the Liberals, but could be wooed by the NDP. Then there's the launch of a National Pharmacare Advisory Committee.
To study, evaluate, and ultimately recommend options on a path forward on pharmacare that puts Canadians first.
A signature NDP promise now potentially on track to be implemented by the Liberals.
This is a fantasy. We don't see even a single dollar of investment in a plan to implement pharmacare.
It all stacks on top of billions of already announced infrastructure spending and billions more for innovation or scientific research at universities. The bulk of it poured into urban centres which skew Liberal or switch with the NDP. It all seems laser-focused on consolidating the Trudeau coalition that delivered that 2015 majority.
But here's the sad reality after 3 years of Justin Trudeau. Never has a politician boasted so loudly and spent so much to achieve so little.
This budget adds nearly $100 billion to the debt. The deficit reduces over time, but there's no plan to balance the books, just to keep spending right to the end of a potential second term in office.
Unemployment rates are near the lowest that we've seen them in 40 years. Mr. Speaker, our plan is working because Canadians are working.
That's the political calculation here, that Canadians are more worried about their jobs and their bank accounts than what's in the government's.
Okay, so that's sort of the domestic politics. Yeah. One of the things that didn't get mentioned at all, I don't think you found his name, Donald Trump, and nothing around that.
No, he's everywhere except in this budget, right? Because the government going into this was under a lot of pressure to match the deep tax cuts that Donald Trump got passed right before Christmas. That argument coming from business leaders, from Perrin Beatty to John Manley, that this made Canada less competitive, and with the NAFTA uncertainty, there's all this extra incentive for businesses to put their money on the U.S. side of the border. So there was pressure here for Morneau to respond. He didn't. He says Canada is still studying the U.S. tax cuts, which aren't fully done yet. The regulations are still being written, and he says they don't want to make an impulsive decision. And let's face it, it's not uncommon for business leaders, Rosie, to go looking for tax cuts. So expect some criticism on this action, especially from the Conservatives. But it's a fight that the Liberals tell me tonight they're prepared to have. If the Conservatives push them too hard on not matching the U.S. tax cuts, they'll say, well, that means bigger deficits. You already don't like the deficits we have. Sure. Or it means cutting programs, taking money away from Indigenous Canadians, single parents or parents. Now, that may be a bit simplistic, but that's how politics is sometimes.
Okay. David Cochran, thanks for your coverage today. As we've been saying, this budget really focused on closing the gender gap. In fact, of 367 pages, I've read almost everyone, no, not yet, nearly everyone had some mention of women, feminism, gender, or equality. And one new measure that could have a really big impact for families. And Adrienne, that's what you're digging into tonight.
You bet, Rosie. That's the changes to parental leave that the government argues could get more women back into the workforce. Let's look at what's changing. So currently, parents can split 35 weeks of EI benefits at 55% of their paycheck. They can also spread it out and accept lower pay over a longer period. But really, any way you slice it, usually it's just mom taking that leave. Now there's a new use it or lose it extra 5 weeks for the parent who didn't give birth to share the work of caring for a new child. Was this an unusual move? Well, that depends what part of the globe you're looking at. Broadly, 95 countries have some sort of paid leave available for the non-birth parent, if you will. 29 countries currently have what they call a designated separate paternity leave, but the amount of money and the amount of time varies widely. There is one important example right here at home, Quebec. It started giving 5 weeks of leave for the second parent in 2005. Since then, new fathers in Quebec claiming paternal benefits soared from less than 30% to 80%. In the rest of Canada, it's more like 12%.
Hello. Oh, not so far back.
The data suggests, quite simply, the more parents share, the better it is for women.
When fathers take paternity leave, a couple of things happen. One, women don't feel as isolated, that they're bearing the whole burden of providing care in that first year. Second, they tend to return to the paid labor force sooner.
1, 2, 3.
Quebec dad Jean-François Bassett took the leave with each of his 4 kids.
I got to spend time with my daughter. My wife got to change careers. She spent some time learning a new job, and it was just Dad Boot Camp 101.
Hello!
But Quebec took that idea and expanded it, combining the parental leave with a province-wide inexpensive daycare program. The new federal budget doesn't do that, and so right away today came the complaints that the leave isn't near enough.
To actually move women to change their decision from staying out of the workforce to entering, you'd have to do something like the $1 billion plus daycare in Quebec.
There you go. Maybe.
And here's something to keep in mind. The budget doesn't actually add new money for this. The changes will come from the $7.5 billion childcare windfall announced last fall. The new leave plan is expected to cost about $1.2 billion over 5 years. And since timing is always everything, it's really important to know the new benefits don't kick in until June of 2019, just in time for the next election. So here's a little bit of an oddity. Fathers in Japan and South Korea have the best benefits in the world. It's in the neighborhood of 12 months of paid leave at roughly 60% of their salaries, and yet only 2 to 3% are taking it because they seem to think all their peers will look down on them if they do. So some changes don't take all that quickly. Now, let's have a look at one of the commitments in the budget that doesn't have any money attached, but affects a lot of people. Andrew?
Yeah, you can say that again, Adrienne. A national drug plan is being talked about yet again. An advisory group is going to look at ways to provide prescription drug coverage for all. But as Vicadopia tells us, this discussion is decades old, and this promise has been made before.
Money's so tight, Shelley Wiggum D'Angelo never eats out. Despite having 2 jobs, she has no drug plan. After food and rent, there wasn't enough left to pay for heart medication. Then, last summer, she had a heart attack.
I was embarrassed. I didn't want to tell anybody that I couldn't afford them.
A recent survey found 1 in 5 Canadian households struggles to pay for prescription drugs.
What does it say about Canada and about Canadians when we're putting our fellow citizens in these positions to make these awful choices?
This family doctor is encouraged the federal government seems serious about pharmacare.
We're announcing the actual advisory council, but a lot of work needs to be done.
The council's job won't be to decide if the public system should pay for prescription drugs, but rather how.
What it can't do is it can't rehash the question and ask once again, do we need to expand Medicare to include public drugs? Because we do.
It was first answered more than 50 years ago in the original blueprint for Medicare. In 1997, the Chrétien Liberals campaigned on bringing pharmacare into reality. But 6 months after getting elected, the health minister at the time threw cold water on the idea, saying it was unaffordable.
Sure, we can completely afford it.
This health economist says a national pharmacare plan might seem expensive. In Canada, $28 billion was spent on prescriptions in one recent year, but the experience of other countries shows a single drug buyer like the federal government can negotiate much lower prices for common medications, though some expensive drugs may not be covered in the public system.
There are some real advantages in terms of having better bargaining power as a national insurer.
Shelley Wiggum D'Angelo now buys the same medication that might have kept her out of the hospital, saving her suffering and the system money. The uneven reality of Canadian healthcare. Vicadopia, CBC News, Toronto.
So how does Canada stack up against other countries? Well, it is the only industrialized nation with a universal healthcare system that doesn't cover essential medications. And take a look at this. On average, New Zealanders spend the least on pharmaceuticals, just $23 per person per year, compared to $158 in Canada. It's a prime example of bulk buying. New Zealand can negotiate lower prices because it's buying drugs for the entire country.
Of course, there's plenty of other measures to talk about in this budget. Here are just a few more of them. The government announced today new money to fight the opioid crisis that has claimed thousands of lives across Canada. A $150 million emergency fund will be set up for provinces to launch treatment programs. Ottawa seems to be embracing the Me Too movement, setting aside $10 million to create a new unit within the RCMP to review sexual assault cases that were dropped by investigators as, quote, unfounded. And the country's national parks will now be permanently free for kids. This comes on the heels of Canada 150, and last year everyone could enter parks at no charge, and it was a huge success. And joining me now, the man of the hour, the Finance Minister, Bill Morneau. Nice to see you, Minister.
Happy to be here.
Let's start with one of the things that's not in the budget. There was a play to parental leave that we've talked a lot about. What there was not was anything for childcare. And you yourself in the budget say that access to quality childcare is a big concern. 1 in 4 families have access to regulated childcare. You know that. You know that getting women into the workforce requires better childcare. Why didn't you commit to more there?
I think this is important. You're absolutely right. But let's recognize that Canada is not a one-size-fits-all country. We put $7.5 billion over 11 years. And what you saw, you can see it in our budget, is provinces have chosen different approaches to approach childcare. There's different approaches everywhere. And what we're saying now is let's maintain an approach to dealing with gender issues through a multitude of approaches.
But you recognize that if you wanted more women back to work, to stay in the workforce, it requires somewhere to put children.
I do think that we have to recognize that's not the only barrier, that the responsibility for childcare does fall disproportionately on women. When I had my kids, there was no opportunity for me to have a use it or leave it parental leave. That would have been a potential thing that I would have thought about. Now we have that option, which I think creates a possibility for women to be able to re-enter the workforce more rapidly and for an more equal sharing of childcare responsibilities that will have a big long-term impact on workforce participation for women.
Pharmacare, you've promised to implement something at some time. There's no money attached. The Liberals promised this in 1997. They found out how expensive it was. They walked away a year later. The PBO says that it'll cost $28 billion. Or $20 billion, sorry. So where's the money? How do we know that you're actually going to do it this time? And are you looking at a price tag that high?
The problem is that there's a significant number of Canadians that don't get pharmacare through their workforce, or that aren't old enough that they get it through the government, or young enough in the case of Ontario where they get it through the government. So we're starting with that problem, recognizing that the solution may not be exactly the way the PBO gets to the overall cost. We already have most employees. I'm pretty sure you have pharmacare. Yes. I have pharmacare. The vast majority of people employed in full-time jobs have pharmacare.
So it'll be means-based?
Well, we're dealing with the people who don't have it, and we're trying to find a way to ensure that it's there. It's fundamentally important as part of healthcare to have pharmaceutical availability. That is complex. What was done 20 years ago, it's not the same as today. We have many more people that operate independently, that aren't working full-time. Sure. There's a different situation, and there's also different provincial plans out there. So it requires some analysis and study, but we're serious. We know that this is an issue, and we are going to get at the analysis to find a way to make sure that we can solve for this problem for the long term.
Last question. This was, as you had signaled, a gender budget, lots of things for women and for other groups in the population. But a lot of people see that then as a political document, that this is you getting ready for an election, sprinkling a little bit everywhere to make sure you have votes. What would you say to them?
Talking about gender means we recognize that more women can be in the workforce because they want to be, more women can get full-time jobs because they want them, and they need to have better outcomes at work, and that will be better for our economy because we'll actually deal with the very real demographic challenge at the same time as giving everyone what they should have, which was just equal opportunity to success.
Minister, thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks very much.